Glenn. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to BSI TV. We have a very exciting interview today. Bowling author, historian, and professor Glenn Gerstner. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Ian.
No problem. So I want to start by addressing a little bit of an elephant in the room in the college bowling landscape. We are losing two very storied programs in Weber International and Stephen F. Austin. These are programs that have won USBC and, or in SFA's case, an NCAA national championship. And this is a pretty big blow to the bowling community as a whole. These are places that some very recognizable players have come through, players that might be bowling on tour. What goes into a decision like that from a university and a college perspective?
Well, I think we should look at those two situations differently, and here's why. You know, Weber, I took a look at their financials after all this happened. They are in serious financial difficulty as an institution, right? Their current assets are less than their current liabilities. Their enrollment has been dropping. Even in their last audit that's available publicly, you know, the auditor said there are questions that Weber University can continue as an ongoing concern. It's pretty serious. So in their case, I think they were looking to cut anything and everything. Now, why they cut only the women and not the men? With the slightest idea, right? It would seem natural to do both, one, or, you know, even if they're looking for Title IX issues, you know, why cut the women and not the men? Stephen F. Austin is a public school in the state of Texas. They've got strong enrollment. You know, state schools are doing pretty well as a group because, you know, we all know the price is right in terms of their tuition. And who knows what's going to happen with Pell Grants and so forth moving forward, given the current political climate. I think that decision was made more about, we have an athletic department that's got a budget, I believe, of around $24 million, and they hardly make any revenue. You know, they're playing Division I, but they're in low Division I, so there really isn't a whole lot of football revenue. You know, my guess was maybe their revenues are 1.5 million. That's less than they pay the football coach. You know, now the obvious solution would be cut football. That would save about $6 million based on what I gathered. They're not cutting football in the state of Texas. Like, it's not happening. You know, it's one thing for Hofstra here on Long Island cut football many years ago. And there was a lot of uproar, but, you know, kind of so what? Hofstra cut football. Yeah, but they took that $5 million a year saving and opened a medical school, which certainly serves the students and alumni and the community far better than having a mediocre, you know, Division I FCS football program. So I think in the case of Stephen F. Austin, their decision was probably just based on what sports do nobody care about other than the participants. And I'm afraid that bowling was one of them.
That makes sense. I understand that monetary gap they were trying to make up was somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million, or at least that's what I gathered from the publications I was able to read. So,
you know, but the reality is that $2 million is the gap between what the university is going to give them, right, and what they gave them the year before.
Sure.
Their athletic department runs at a $20 million plus deficit. They're hardly generating any revenue. So whatever number the school is throwing out there, that's just a number saying, look, here's $22 million, you have to live on that. So it's not like, you know, the impression that a lot of people get is when they heard what the athletic director said, oh, well, they're running a $2 million deficit. Once they make these cuts, athletics is going to be now self-sustaining. No chance. No chance. It's an extracurricular activity. It's not all that much different at a school like that. It's not all that much different than the student newspaper, you know, or the radio station. The only schools that are self-sustaining, are the Michigans, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Alabama. You can rattle them off, and what they all have in common is they play gigantic football. If you don't play gigantic football, ask UConn. Their deficit is $55 million in athletics. $55 million. I mean, if I was a taxpayer in the state of Connecticut, I wouldn't be thrilled about that. Yeah, the basketball team wins, and maybe they get a couple extra students because of that. But, what I would always tell my students when we would talk about this is the students would say, well, doesn't it encourage students to attend that school? And I said, if a student is attending a school because they're good in basketball and they don't play basketball, it's not the world's greatest student. I'm sorry. Not someone that they're really digging their heels in to try and get. But I think, both of the cases with Weber and SFA, it just kind of illustrates the budget realities of college sports these days. Football is king. Basketball is a close second. Unless you're like playing softball big time in the Southeast Conference or hockey at Vermont or basketball, women's basketball at UConn or Tennessee, sports are in trouble that don't generate any revenue.
That makes sense. And I guess at the end of the day, and I'm certainly in this boat coaching at a Division II institution, the narrative turns to enrollment, right? So when you have these non-revenue generating sports, especially in places where maybe the potential doesn't exist to generate that revenue, the larger the roster, the more enrollment you're adding to the institution, the greater the value to the school is. Like one thing we just did, we added sprint football this past year. And that's kind of exciting that we're this little Catholic school on Long Island adding something of a football program. But the roster is on the larger side. At the end of the day, it's a football team. So the number of students added, or the amount of the value added to the school is kind of, I guess, the attraction for an athletic director making that choice, which I guess brings us back to, at least on the side of women's bowling, aside from enrollment itself, Title IX. We go back to Weber. I mean, I can say that their men's roster has been much larger than their women's roster. You speculated on, I don't know why they cut one and not the other. Maybe that had a little something to do with it, that they felt like there was value added in the enrollment number on the men's side.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with the NAIA rules. Is bowling a scholarship sport in NAIA for men?
It depends on the institution. I don't know the specifics at Weber International.
But let's say, I mean, they have to. If they do, they have to have a limit. Say the limit is 6. I believe that's the limit on women NCAA. But if you've got 24 other kids bowling who are paying tuition, then I can see how that helps. The question is, and I'll use an example when they dropped the program at St. John's. And I tried to make my case to the director of student life because, St. John's, like most men's bowling teams, club sport, not run through athletics. And I said, if 2 students come to St. John's each year who would not have come to St. John's because there wasn't a bowling team, it breaks even. That's the mathematics of it, right? And, you go back and you think about the best players in St. John's, and even people that didn't go to St. John's know these names. Mike Fagan, Brian Zeisig, Mike Mullen. They wouldn't have come to St. John's if there wasn't a bowling team. I mean, Fagan and Mullen were top, award-winning juniors. They would have went somewhere where they had bowling. So they got 4 years of paying tuition. And I think it's true for a lot of the kids that went to St. John's over the years. I'm thinking Brandon Sotomayor. He wouldn't have went to St. John's if there wasn't a bowling team. He won junior gold. He would have went someplace else. And I think that's what a lot of the universities forget is, even in a club sport, first of all, you don't have scholarships, so everybody's paying something. If you get a handful of kids, 2 or 3, that are attending specifically because of bowling, you've already paid for the program. So it's not the huge money loser that they sometimes think it is.
Well, I'm glad you brought up our beloved St. John's, because I am also in that boat of people you just named, although I can't say I've had the competitive career that any of them have had. But I do want to bring up this component of that program produced a vast number of industry professionals. So there are the group of people you just named, many of them bowled on tour for some time. But then we can talk about Jim Lizzo, who I've worked for many years. We could talk about Mark Gerbrich, who was the PBA commissioner, right? So, and I'm coaching a collegiate program. I mean, I can go on and on. What does a university, when they make that choice, do they look at what value a program has added to the education of the people who went through it? Was that a factor? Was that something that was discussed? Because aside from the fact that when St. John's cut the program, they were the 12th ranked team in the country. Again, from the outside looking in, similar to the SFA case, similar to the Weber case, it's like, well, this is a very successful program. Why is the school doing this? And then you get into the economics and the solvency. And it was during COVID. So obviously that's a stressor and an extra component. But was that history looked upon of, wow, we got a lot of people working in this industry that would not have been doing that without the presence of the program?
No, that's the only answer I can give you. I am pretty sure no administrator at St. John's could name anyone that went through the bowling program and made a success of themselves, other than those in sport management. You know, when I coached Mark in college, and I coached Jimmy Lizzo and his brother, and I coached Tom Adams, you know, who's originally owned Walmart, and now he doesn't do bowling anymore, but he does trophies. So yeah, we've had a lot of people that have come through that program and made bowling their career. You know, the short answer is, and the university doesn't care. I mean, in the case of the bowling team, COVID came around. That was a great opportunity to whack it. I'm sure they were looking to cut bowling for a long time. And what was the budget? $35,000, $40,000? It didn't cost a lot of money. That's, you know, Rick Pitino's weekly salary. I'll go ahead and say it. Right. Now,
Sure.
granted, basketball is different because basketball does bring in revenue. Basketball on its own is clearly self-sufficient at St. John's, but the rest of the athletic program hardly takes in a dime. You know,
Right.
so I think the opportunity was there to cut the program, and they did it. And my understanding is, you know, they asked Wacky and said, "Well, you come back and coach, but we can't pay you." That's insane. You know, that's their way of saying, "Oh, but we could have had a program." No. That's not how you treat somebody that's been a loyal employee for 35 years.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it's my understanding, I've done a little poking around, but I do believe that Coach Bill Delosky, Wacky as he's colloquially known in this industry, he was the longest tenured head coach in college on either the men's or the women's side at the time of the program being cut or having their funding cut, if we want to use the accurate lingo. And it broke my heart. I mean, I'm not here to rehash the emotions that went into that, but I do want to shine light on the fact that there's a large network of people and people who affect our sport that had an impact on. And there's no doubt that the same thing will go on at SFA and at Weber. And I do want to bring up a couple of other cases. One of them is Tennessee Southern, or what was Martin Methodist, Bob Learn's program. They were the top ranked men's team, and I believe it was the fourth ranked women's team in the country at the time that the school informed Bob and informed the student athletes that the program was not going to be competing the following year. And I give those rankings that they were in the NAIA. I give those rankings as per the USBC side of collegiate bowling. But that's crazy to me to have an infrastructure that's successful and to just pull the rug out from under it. I mean, but I guess it's the same economics that you've been talking about so far.
Here's how the university will look at that. Whether the team is ranked number 1 or number 100, how much extra revenue is the school generating because you're ranked number 1? And in bowling, the answer is close to 0. That's the unfortunate part. But you can say that about any number of sports: golf, swimming, fencing. You know, you can say that about a lot of sports. They don't bring in revenue, but that's not why you sponsor sports. You don't sponsor sports to make money. You sponsor sports to provide an extracurricular activity for students that want to continue their career as an athlete. That's how it all started. And now we kind of got it narrowed down to football and basketball, and the softball World Series is going on. The College World Series in baseball will go on next week, and you've got places like LSU where they put 12,000 people in for every baseball game. But that's the outlier. Most baseball programs don't generate any revenue. So I think this is kind of like a tipping point here that, I see a lot of talk online. Well, if the sport doesn't pull its weight, you got to cut it. Well, at most schools, you know what you're going to have left? Football and basketball, and maybe women's basketball. And like I said, maybe the hockey at Vermont, baseball at Florida and LSU and so forth. That's not what college sports was designed to do.
So I guess that brings me to this. Where do you see the landscape of college bowling, especially NCAA bowling, being 5 years from now? Because we have these NIL issues. This is going to further make the economic equation difficult on institutions. If they're trying to bring in football talent, trying to bring in basketball talent, it's going to require a cash burn or a benefactor. What do you think this is going to look like in 2030?
Well, I think, I'm sure you read, Cooper Flagg, $28 million in NIL money at Duke. He's going to take a pay cut if he goes to the NBA. But we have to look away from those, top prospects in football and basketball. There's a court case going through the courts right now. I know it's been decided, appealed back and forth. I think the key case for bowling is the case about the female tennis player who doesn't want to turn down earnings in a tournament.
Sure.
And I think the way it is now, if Jillian Martin, I'm thinking of when she was still in Nebraska, right?
Exactly.
The 60 grand that she won in the Queens. Now look, it's smart money. She's already on a full ride, right? Maybe she's going to go get a master's degree. I mean, I heard her on a couple interviews. She's not really convinced that she's going to become a professional. She wants to get into the healthcare field. And I understand. I can't for the life of me understand how you can let a basketball player take $28 million for doing advertisements, but deny a bowler or a tennis player or a golfer, they're all in the same category, that they have to turn down prize money because they're amateurs. They're not amateurs anymore, right? That ship has sailed. So I think that's one thing that could really help college bowling is, on the men's side, if you're not NCAA or NIA, you can take the money.
Well,
years ago when I was in college, a kid from Pace won the Miller doubles, 25 grand. Fine, it's a club sport, no problem. And this was in like 1980. 25 grand was a lot of money. Probably about 100 grand today. So I think for the women especially, being able to take prize money in tournaments, because look, we see, you've got now 17-year-old kids, this Brandolino, right, and the other girls like her that are going out there competing with the women. And look, let's face it, especially for the women, we've seen female tennis players and golfers win in their teens on the professional tours. We shouldn't think anything's different in bowling.
Sure. And I guess there has been some progress on the issue of NIL where, at least people developing an image. I guess the two people I think about in the youth, in the girls' world are Malia Briggs and Bella Castillo. Because, okay, they're wonderful bowlers, whatever. I'm sure they have amazing futures in store for them at the collegiate level or wherever else they want to go in the sport. But they've also generated massive social media followings and stand to really create a quite an economic windfall for themselves if they continue to market themselves correctly. And I guess it's good that in yesteryear they would not have been able to do that or see a dollar of the brand equity they've created, but now they can without impairing their ability to compete. So I guess that's progress, but I couldn't agree with you more on matters of why are we still perpetuating this illusion of amateurism when it's just not the reality of the landscape anymore.
Yeah, there's going to be a reckoning in college sports soon. I've always said, I probably said this for 15 years, even before NIL. I fully expect the Power Four universities to just pull out of the NCAA and go do their own thing. They only compete against each other anyway. They're the only ones that are competing for the national championship in basketball and football. Although, yeah, every once in a while a basketball team, Loyola of Chicago slips in to get in the Final Four. But I think those 64 schools, or I guess it's 70 now, they should just leave. Because the idea that Alabama and Malloy and Farmingdale are all in the same organization when it comes to athletics, why? The objectives are completely different.
Yeah.
And those three of those schools. And I understand they're separated by division, but they're still all in the NCAA. So those schools that say, look, we want to run this like a business. We want to make money. They should go form their own organization with their own rules. People will still watch. The great thing about college sports is doesn't matter who's playing. We saw that in basketball. The best players leave after 1 year. Hasn't done one thing to hurt the popularity of college basketball because you're rooting for the team, not the players, right? You're an alumni. That's why you root for your school. It doesn't matter who's playing. Other people say, well, it's not the same if they get paid. Nobody cares. Whether you pay the coach $13 million or pay the player $5 million, what's the difference? I don't think the fans care. So college football and basketball are their own animal. And I think it's going to lead to this division at some point. And I also believe clearly bowling is not going to be part of that. I don't think there's one bowling program in that group. Maybe Vanderbilt. Wichita State is not in the Power Four. Vanderbilt might be the only college bowling program for women that gives scholarships that's in that Power Four. I'm thinking off the top of my head, the only one I can think of. And of course, the crazy thing is they're one of the few private schools in that whole group.
True. It's true. And yeah, I get to see a lot of John. We serve on the national committee together, and him and Josie are just running a wonderful program there, of course. But yeah, the from an economic point of view, they're definitely in a different world than I am in terms of the ability to to do what they do. Professor, we are a little over the 22-minute mark here, so I do want to steer this a different way. One of the things I mentioned when I introduced you was that you are an author, and I'd love for you to have a few minutes to tell our viewers about bowling's first superstar, Andy Varapapa. You authored this wonderful book and did a tremendous amount of research. So take us through what it was like going on this journey and writing this.
Yeah, it was, I guess everybody wants to write a book. Most people say, I want to write the great American novel. Well, I'm not much of a novelist, but I do know how to do research and I do know how to write a little bit. So I got this idea to write a book about Andy Varapapa. And, the reason I chose him was I knew his son, Frank, very well. And I know his grandson, Andy II, very well. In fact, I saw Andy II at Bowl Expo last year, and I expect to see him there again this year. So I got into this, we'll call it a rabbit hole of writing this book. And for me personally, the great thing was I learned so much about bowling history that I wasn't aware of. I'm like a lot of us, I'm an armchair historian, but when it came to bowling, I didn't really know about how bowling developed over the years or what bowling was like. Every once in a while, I see a poll on Facebook, who's the greatest bowler ever? And I'm like, bowling didn't start in 1959. You ever hear of a guy named Don Carter, right? Hear a guy named Ned Day? And like, who are these people? Well, these are the people that I learned about writing the book. And although it is a biography of Andy Varapapa, I mean, a good third of the book is just a review of bowling history, because you can't put the subject of your biography, you have to put them in the context of their times. And Varapapa came along at the right time. It just so happened that he came along at the right time when bowling was started to grow. By the time he retired really from competition, and he was 70 years old when he retired, that was 1961. The PBA was just getting off the ground, and it was ready to then explode into what it became in the 60s and 70s. Young people today have no idea. The Pro Bowlers Tour got better ratings than almost every sport except football and baseball. Got better ratings than hockey, better ratings than the NBA. I told a story in the book. The AC Dolco Classic, the first tournament of the season from California. I think it was 1981. There was a college basketball game. Ralph Sampson and Michael Jordan are playing against each other, number one and number two. The bowling outdrew that game. That's how popular bowling was. It's hard to believe that it's so popular.
Well, you did mention what has always been the soundbite on this subject and a conversation on sports economics, but Don Carter was the first $1 million endorsed athlete in any sport. That's crazy to think about when today's bowlers, I mean, what is it, the top 10 in the world maybe that are making a living just from throwing a ball?
Yeah, if that, and it's interesting because you hear people, I heard an interview with Tony Westlake. Now that's a name that a lot of young people don't know. Back in the 80s, he probably won about 4, 5, 6 titles. He was always known about a guy being tough in the clutch. He bowled a lot of action. Rudy can tell you a story about bowling at Royal Lanes in Hempstead with him and David Ozio and Gary Dickinson, and Westlake cleaned Rudy's clock, and he's freely admits that, hey, he had the shot. He just quit the tour because he needed to get a job, and he was a top 10 money earner guy. And the other example, of course, is Fagan. Fagan, one of the 5 best bowlers in the world. He said, you know what? I'm going to go back and get my master's to get a real job. And good for him. And now, of course, it's come full circle. Now he's back. He owns a bowling center down in New Mexico. So it's all come full circle. I'm afraid that there's going to be more people choosing that path and saying, you know what, like bowling is great, but I need to have a real job. And I'll never forget what Mike told me when he was applying to graduate school. I helped him with his essays because I've read a lot in my days as the director of the grad program at St. John's. And he said, no offense to any of these other guys. I don't want to have to bowl for a living when I'm 50. And again, no offense to the guys that do. This is what they do. But he's like, I think I can do something else other than bowling. No doubt, Mike would have won a lot more tournaments. One of my guys I bowl with, they go out and bowl the Nationals. Mike picks up a ball once a year. He bowls 9 games, and he shoots 1850. Without, just like that. Let me put a little tape on my thumb hole. I'm ready to go. That's how much talent he has. Right? It's amazing.
It surely is. So, going back to Andy here a minute, obviously you made your personal connection. Go find it on Amazon, everybody. It's a wonderful, wonderful read and a walk through bowling history, as Professor mentioned. You mentioned you learned a lot about the history of the game. What's one thing that either shocked you or moved you? One thing that you took away from the experience of writing this that you went, wow, this changed my perspective?
I think what people don't understand is that bowling as we know it today is you bowl a league for 36 weeks, right? And that we can argue about is 36 weeks the right length of the league. I think it's way too long. But you bowl leagues when you bowl tournaments on the weekends. Prior to 1920s, there was no such thing as a league. Guys would get together and they would have a club. You'd have your bowling club. And then you would go challenge other clubs to a match. There's no such thing as a league. Everything was like a giant pickup game. And finally, right after World War I, some of the bowling proprietors got together and said, you know what, we need to have a little bit more structure to this. And the other thing about bowling prior to World War I, you didn't pay for your games. Bowling was created as a diversion for a bar. Bar has a pool table, bar has a pinball machine, bar has a video game. Back then, bar had a bowling alley, usually 2. And you would go in, and to pass the time, you would bowl. And of course, the idea being, as you're bowling, then you're going to drink and spend money, and you're going to buy food and spend money. And that also reminds people, this argument comes up all the time. Oh, why isn't bowling in the same category as golf? Why isn't bowling in the same category as tennis? Well, bowling started in bars. Golf and tennis started in country clubs. Right? Golf and tennis started as sports that poor people weren't even allowed to play. Whereas in bowling, rich people didn't bowl. Like it was looked down on bowling as like this sport for the have-nots. And then in terms of tournaments, the first tournament as we know it today was 1922, the World Classic. The next tournament after that was the BPAA All-Star in 1941. Next tournament after that was the World's Invitational, and then they invented the PBA. But guys couldn't go bowl tournaments. Nelson Burton told me, hey, I was able to bowl every week against the best bowlers in the world. Guys like his father, Nelson Burton Sr., Andy, Ned Day, they bowl a tournament every 6 months. It's just different. So I think that's the thing that people don't understand is how the entire landscape of not only recreational bowling, like league bowling, and professional bowling is unrecognizable. Unrecognizable. And I think that if people read the book, you'll learn about all that.
Once again, Bowling's for a Superstar, Andy Varapapa. Go get it on Amazon. Professor, we are about out of time, so I am going to bid you farewell here. But thank you so much for coming on BSI TV. We really appreciate your time today, your perspective. You're an amazing bowling historian, and your perspective on the economics of college athletics and what that might mean for college bowling going forward as well. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time on BSI TV, I'm Ian Parisi, Professor Gerstner. Have a good day.